Hello, welcome to Orthodox Christian Television. My name is Father Christodoulos. I have Vasily Biniadis with me and my friend Michael Halford. We're going to change the format of Orthodox Christian Television quite a bit. We're not going to do lectures anymore. We're going to do basically book reviews. We're going to take Orthodox Christian spirituality in print, in books, and we're going to review these books and discuss them and explore the ideas that are in the books. We decided to start this series with a book that had a profound effect on my life, and I think on Michael's life and on Vasily's life as well. The name of the book is Franks, Romans, Feudalism and Doctrine, an Interplay Between Theology and Society by Father John S. Romanidis. This book, I'll show it to the camera, is the book that we're talking about today. It's a very unwieldy title, Franks, Romans, Feudalism and Doctrine, an Interplay Between Theology and Society. We're going to discuss this book and explore how it had, why it had such a deep effect on our lives. I'll begin by giving quickly a brief synopsis of the thesis of the book, which is that the schism between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity, or the Western part of the Roman Empire and the Eastern part of the Roman Empire, was not a schism really at all between a Greek East and a Latin West. It was not a schism between Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox. It was not a schism between a mainly Greek Byzantine Empire and a mainly Latin Roman Empire in the West. There was nothing of the kind. According to Father John Romanidis, and according to the historical sources, the schism really was a split between Romans in the East, what was left of the Roman Empire in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and the Frankish conquerors, those Franks who conquered the Romans in the West. The Franks came in from their Germanic homelands, the Franks being a Germanic Teutonic tribe of illiterate barbarians. They came in from their German homeland and conquered the sophisticated civilization of the Romans in the West. And when they did this, they set up the false historical lie that the empire in the East was now Greek and therefore heretical, and that the empire in the West was the Holy Roman Empire, or was what was left of the Roman Empire. So I'll open up the conversation now to the three of us, but basically the Frankish West and a Roman East is what Father John Romanidis is explaining in this book, not a Latin West and a Greek East. So did I explain the thesis too simply, or you want to pick it up from anywhere? I mean, when I first heard this blew me away. When I first read this book, I never heard anything like this. And growing up in America and going to high school and junior high, you know, we learned about the Greeks and the Romans, and we always thought that the Greeks and the Romans were two different things. And now I understand that to be a Greek is to be a Roman, and to be a Roman is to be a Greek. And any part of the Roman Empire that you were in, whether you were a Celt or a Hispanic or an African, you were a Roman and you were Orthodox, and you had a Greek culture that you were surrounded by within a Roman political system. Similar to like you're a English American, Anglo-Saxon American, I'm a Greek American, or we're Greek Americans, they're Italian Americans. You had Greek Romans, Latin Romans, African Romans, Celtic Romans. And this is what Father John is talking about. And it was this propaganda ploy that Charlemagne and the Franks started in order to divide and conquer the Roman Empire.
And a big part of that also is, other than the propaganda and the educational, methodology being used to propagate that whole belief. Also, there's another aspect to it, is that basically we sometimes assume inherently that things have always been in the past the same way they are today. And today you have a Latin Western Christianity and a so-called Greek Eastern Christianity, and you kind of just assume that that's the way it was. And that's what's also taught in the educational system. And, also, you summed it up perfectly. That was basically the major shock factor initially with reading this book, and what Father John says as far as the oneness of the Roman Empire and its belief system as well, and its faith.
Well, what do you think of that when he says that the Romans were really Greeks and that the Greeks were really Romans? I mean, what does that mean? What is that all about? I mean, I always thought that the Romans were Romans and the Greeks were Greeks.
Well, it's hard to swallow at first, yeah,
Romans
because
spoke
that's
Latin,
how you...
Greeks
right.
spoke Greek.
Yeah, but unfortunately, for those that propagate this myth of the Latin East and the Latin West and the Greek East, the record of history shows that the Greek was spoken all throughout the empire, that most of the people were bilingual or trilingual, they spoke several languages, and that Greek was the lingua franca, the language of culture for most of the
Roman population.
which surprised me, because if you think about it, Paul the Apostle's writing an epistle to the Romans. If the Romans were a Latin-speaking people, as the Frankish historians claim, why didn't he choose to write his epistle in Greek, not Latin?
That's a good question.
Absolutely.
His letter to the Romans is written in Greek. All his letters are written in Greek, even to the Galatians. So the Galatians were a Romanized Celtic people living not in Ireland, but in today's Turkey.
So you would presume that
yeah, if you're writing specifically to the Romans. You think he would write in Latin. So clearly the evidence shows that the Latin, to be Latin was not necessarily to be a Roman. And to be a Roman, he explains in another paper of his, but he does talk about it in this book too, that there was never an identity of Romans with Latin. Latin and Roman was not really the same thing. In fact, he explains that Romans actually fought the Latins at one point. So really then, why did the Roman Empire not call itself a Greek Empire? I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is, what I'm trying to remember is my first confusion when I first read this book, the first confusion that set in the first time I read it, because that's really what happened to me. When I first read this book, it was about 10 years ago, and it really...
Well, the Greeks primarily were identified as the pagans, those that worshiped the pagans. When paganism was defeated by...
Well, let's go back to when they were both, when everyone was a pagan. Let's start with the Roman Empire when it was pagan. So you couldn't say that to call somebody a Greek was to call them a pagan rather than a Christian. Let's go before the church started. Let's go to pagan times. Well, was there a Roman people and was there a Greek people that were not...
Maybe prior to Rome conquering the Greek Empire.
Okay. So
but when Rome conquered the Greek Empire, it became Greek.
It essentially was Hellenized.
Yes.
Greekized. For those who, so
which is something about that you don't, when you study history, they don't tell you this.
Right. And also the term you just used, although probably understood a lot more clearly by most of the viewers, is also inaccurate. You know, Hellenized versus Greekized.
Well, I use the word Greekized because some people don't
understood.
Hellenized.
Right,
Hellenized, being Hellenic is being Greek. So let's keep the terminology clear.
And another reason also, I think the shock factor, you know, you're trying to understand why you were shocked initially. I don't know about yourself personally, but also as a young Greek American when I first learned this, and I basically traced the root of my shock. Basically, there's a big gap many times in the historical timeline. You basically have ancient Greece, and then you have post-1821 Greece, and what it is to be a Greek as far as nationality is concerned. And you miss that whole interim, which is the Roman period, the Hellenized Roman period, which is basically blowing the American experiment out of water. You know, a lot of people say the span from East Coast to West Coast has been one of the greatest experiments of time, but basically in order to assimilate, to come to the United States and be a member of this great experiment, you basically have to assimilate into the American culture and language and so forth. Whereas you had Rome, and although Hellenic was, widely used amongst many of the people, you did have different cultures and different languages being used, yet... being unified under a Roman Greco... administration. In other words, it became a Greco-Roman world. Exactly. In other words, I think what Father John is saying in this book is the Latins who founded the city of Rome, I mean, the Romans who founded the city of Rome, were a branch of were a Latin tribe. Yeah. They were one of the tribes of the Latins who founded a city that they called Rome. And this city basically had a Hellenic culture. This particular group of Latins, not all the Latins became Hellenized. No. This particular group of Latins who founded the city of Rome were Hellenized. They adopted, I remember in junior high school, when we did the Greek chapter, then we went to the Roman chapter, the gods were the same, but they just changed the names. From, Zeus became Jupiter. Right. And Dionysius became Bacchus. Some of the names weren't even changed. So they wore togas. They had columns with a triangle on top for their buildings. They had some variations in the architecture, but almost nothing. Maybe they invented the aqueduct. They had basically the alphabet, or the Greek alphabet. They did some variation on it. So basically, the city of Rome was a Greco-Roman city.
and that these now Romans went and conquered the whole world with the Hellenic culture. And when they actually came upon the ancient Greeks, they basically just assimilated with them and incorporated them into their empire that grew and became enormous. So it was really
That's why in what the West calls later Byzantine times, the actual language of the Roman Empire, which was called
Romaic. Oh, so in other words, the Byzantines didn't say that they spoke Greek.
No.
They called their language Romaic, even though we would call it Greek.
Yes.
Even though it is Greek. They didn't call themselves Greeks.
No, and they called the language they spoke Roman.
They called their language Roman.
Nor did they call themselves Byzantine either.
Back a little further, before the term Byzantine came up, the Roman Empire in the East, as Father John in this book explains, when the Franks conquered the western half of the Roman Empire, they came up with a label for the rest of the Roman Empire that they hadn't conquered yet. They hadn't conquered really the vast and most powerful and most wealthy part of the empire, which was in the East. The Roman Empire that was free and still an independent empire. They came up with a new name for it, a label for it, which was Greek. They started calling it Greek, and they started calling themselves the Romans. Why would they pick the name Greek, Michael? I mean, what was the point of the Franks? First of all, what was the point of that?
Because by the time they had conquered, Greek had come to mean, in the popular vernacular, pagan and heretic.
So they were, in other words, they were calling the Romans heretics.
Yes.
In other words, to try and maybe claim that they weren't really Romans.
That's right.
Because to be a Roman was to be a Christian.
That's right.
To be a Greek was to be a pagan. So to call somebody a Greek was it was a great insult, more than an insult. It was to call them a heretic.
Yeah.
So Charlemagne, who was the great father of the Franks, was the one who began this great lie of calling the Romans in the East the Greeks, and then later the term Byzantine.
And it's also ironic to know why they were tagged this classification of being Greek, connotating heretic, is basically for staying steadfast in the Christian faith as it was to that point. Basically, it was a sour grapes way of saying you're not accepting our innovations, therefore, and they basically started displacing the bishops of the areas.
Well, displace, I think, is too kind of word.
What word would you use, Michael?
Torture and murder would probably be a far more accurate.
A purge, a Stalinist type purge. They came in
and in fact, they divided the spoils. They gave the control of these various bishoprics to their buddies, their conquering
fellow warlords. And set up castles and they wholesale moved the populations out of the cities into the countryside. They built walled fortresses to keep them in, and they created the beginnings of the feudal system. So the feudal system in Western Europe, this is what really blew me away. This is really, because up until then, I never really could understand when I was a kid in junior high school, thinking, you had these masses of serfs working in the fields, and you had this one guy in his family living in this beautiful castle. How did he get in that castle, and who helped him build it?
Right.
How was he able to get the masses of the people to allow him to be in this position? We were never taught that there was basically a conquering army that had come in and set up the system, and that these people were basically what was left of the free Roman Christians that were now being enslaved on really slave labor camps, which is really what life was like in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, like living like a slave. Really slave labor camps set up by the Franks, and you had the bishops, on the one hand, who were former Frankish warlords, keeping the people in fear of going to hell. And on the other hand, you had the Duke and his knights keeping the people from going in fear of going to hell sooner than they really will be if they just live a normal life, which at that time was maybe 30 or 40 years, and then you were dead.
And that's how these popular terms like villain, i.e. the person that lived in the villa, which was the name of the slave labor camp, became the villain. And the word Frank, which,
honest and straightforward,
came to mean everything positive. Mm-hmm. In fact, you think about, we get the word franchise, i.e. to be made free, from the word frank.
To become a frank.
To become a frank.
In other words, if you were a Roman, you were still without your franchise. You were still not a frank, and you were still a slave.
And the same term is also applied in America as well in the earlier days of our nation with slavery as well.
Because people talk about the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages didn't happen accidentally. The Dark Ages were dark because the Franks wanted them dark. They wanted education. They literally wanted to obliterate an indigent culture. to destroy all traces of the Roman Greek culture from the conquered people.
Well, thanks, but why did the Franks want to obliterate all traces of Rome?
Because there were repeated
Orthodox Christianity.
There were repeated rebellions and there were repeated revolutions. There were repeated attempts by the oppressed people to throw off their Frankish warlords, and these were aided and fomented by that part of the Roman Empire which was still free.
Constantinople.
Yes,
and also at the fall of Constantinople. Now that you mentioned Constantinople, it's interesting. Hopefully my memory serves me correct. When the emperor at the time, Constantine Palaiologos, the city was basically falling, collapsing around them, and assistance was being offered from the West. Of course, with the one condition that he basically subjugate himself to the West and the Western Emperor and the Pope.
And adopt the Frankish religion.
Exactly, and he basically refused that, saying that he'd rather live X amount of years under the Islamic rule, the Ottoman rule.
Well, I think the expression is better we wear the Turkish turban than the Frankish tiara.
Absolutely, that's where it comes from.
Which
shows you the magnitude, right?
Better Turk than Frank.
Right. It shows you the magnitude of what a Roman at that time thought.
Becoming a Frank, how horrible that was.
Absolutely.
It's the same pattern after the Khmer Rouge conquered in Cambodia. They moved everyone out into the countryside.
Into the countryside.
And they killed all the intellectuals. And
Cambodia went into Dark Ages.
And they went into the Dark Ages. It was the same pattern. It was the same obliteration of a culture.
That's interesting. Khmer Rouge is a French word, which is has a French language has Frankish roots. I don't know if there's any connection there, but the Cambodians speak French, don't they?
Yes.
I may be making a leap. I'm making a leap. But I maybe not so much of a leap, because Western European culture really is an oppressive, elitist, racist kind of a culture. I mean, it's got its great moments, Mozart, and I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate. We're not trying to denigrate here Western culture as a whole. We're not trying to do that, because Western culture has evolved and has become one of the great cultures of the earth. But in its Frankish, at its worst, in its Frankish form, it's really dark and...
Yeah, but all the evils that people think about Western culture, the racism, the idea of superiority, the class structure, the
class structure of elite and subjugated.
Subjugate. All of this has its roots in the Frankish occupation of the Western Roman Empire.
Michael's correct, and also another aspect of this is, and it's very scary. You speak of the Dark Ages. I mean, when you utilize something as strong and powerful as the name of God to implement these policies, it's very far-reaching in the sense that you eliminate the knowledgeable people, the intellectual people of your society. The Romans at the time pushed out, subjugated in these feudalistic societies, little villages called, and they were called villains. And then basically the lower class people, the people who weren't as intellectually advanced, basically are scared out of their wits to believe that God is going to damn them for all eternity if they don't basically do what's being dictated to them by the bishops or the military rules of the time. It's very scary and could have that effect of the Dark Ages, and I think the issue becomes human freedom as opposed to, which culture is better or not. I think that's really a whole other discussion, but it's really the human freedom at stake.
We can say some cultures are better than
absolutely.
others. I don't think.
But if this,
that's not being a racist.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Maybe a culturalist,
right.
but go ahead.
But I'm just saying the point at hand here is basically also to a large degree human freedom. And we speak so much of that today that it's basically shunned, it's never discussed, that the Dark Ages were basically a dark age for the human soul. And basically, you mentioned earlier the therapeutic process was taken away from the face of this earth.
Pontius Pilate, getting back to a biblical example, Pontius Pilate, in all likelihood, spoke Greek, as most of the Roman officials, because the language of culture in that part of the world was Greek.
Or all the civilized world, and the ecumenes, they would say. Greek was the...
Which, it's like the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman philosopher. He wrote in the Greek language. He didn't write in the Latin language. And, of course there were Latin-speaking people like Seneca and others that wrote in the Latin language, but Greek became the universal language. It became like English is today.
Right, throughout the world.
Yeah.
Since, we focus a lot of times on the pessimism of the issue, but I think one interesting note prior to us ending the show is also to just state, and I hope I'm correct in this, but despite all this, there's still a continuity, and the continuity of what it means to be Roman, I think, still exists today.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that we may not be able to tell who the Franks are today.
It's very difficult to tell which either is, but
But there are some Romans left in the world
Absolutely.
today, and they would be.
well, I think I would hope at least that what it means to be Roman still survives within the Orthodox Church.
In the Orthodox Church. So it's not a racial or ethnic
Not at
thing.
all.
It's an idea, it's a culture, it's a religion, it's a way of life.
Right.
It's to be Roman is not to be wearing a toga and
No.
have Latin
No,
blood.
it's the ideals that the Roman Empire stood for. The idea of a Christian empire, a Christian worldview, a Christian nation.
Of whatever color, whatever race,
National
whatever,
identity, ethnic identity.
whatever ethnic identity
Right.
it may be, and that this was the salvation of this empire would be the Orthodox Christian, or really the Christian Church,
The Christian church.
Yes.
which was the institution of the most important institution within that nation.
Yeah.
And it survives in the Roman patriarchates that are still
In
left.
Constantinople
There's still
and other areas.
Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria are still, or really what is left, the tiny bit that is left of the Roman Empire.
And to this day in those areas, in a lot of those areas, and specifically in Constantinople, where predominantly a Turkish Muslim population exists, they still refer to the Orthodox Christians, predominantly who were Hellenic, who lived there prior, as Romans, Rum.
As Romans, as the Palestinian Orthodox, who are not Arabs. Who that's another thing that that blew me away. That the Palestinians are not really Arabs. They're really descendants of the Roman Christians, the Roman Orthodox Christians, who now have learned to speak Arabic over the centuries, and they call themselves the Rum Orthodox.
Roman
To
Orthodox.
this day. So I think we're about ready to wrap up. This is Orthodox Christian Television. I want to thank Vasily
Thank you.
Vinyatis,
Thank you,
Michael
Father.
Halford. I'm Father Christodoulos. Orthodox Christian Television is on every Saturday at 7:30 and every Sunday at 3:30. Thank you for watching.
Kyrie,